Hello and welcome, everybody. It is great to see you all online, or at least to know that you're all online. I'm Scarlett Wirt, the Program Coordinator for the Washington chapter of the National Railway Historical Society. Our mission is to expand the public appreciation of railroads and their history through preservation and education. One of the ways we do this is through free public programs. Moving on to the main event, we're honored tonight to welcome Bill Wright, who will preview his upcoming book, Now Arriving Washington, Union Station and Life in the Nation's Capital, to be published by Georgetown University Press in 2021. The book describes how Washington's Grand Terminal has been deeply connected to almost every aspect of life in the city: transportation, politics and government, urban design, economics, and social patterns since its opening in 1907. Despite many changes in its operations, Union Station remains a building that reveals more about life in modern Washington than any other, simultaneously reflecting and shaping the development of the capital and, in many cases, the country. Bill, a graduate student in American history at Duke University and the University of North Carolina, has shared the station's history through tours, articles, and presentations, as well as the development of an app that enables visitors to guide themselves through more than 100 years of the station's rich and storied history. Please welcome Bill Wright.
Thank you, Scarlett, and both for the introduction, but also for you and for Anne and the rest of the Society for inviting me. I also want to thank other people at the Society who over the years have really helped me, particularly Jim Lilly and Kevin Tankersley, because I wouldn't have learned all the things that I have about Union Station without their help. And so I really appreciate what I've been able to gather from them. As Scarlett mentioned, I want to do an overview of the book that I'm fortunate enough to be writing and give you some sense of the ways in which I see the station connecting to Washington. And going to pause, as Scarlett mentioned, also a couple times to take questions. And then at the end, we'll have another opportunity. If you think of things later, I'm going to make a couple requests. Feel free to get in touch. I'll share my email address at the end, because one of the things that's been fun about this project is learning from other people and finding out things they know that I don't. And so I really appreciate any ideas or artifacts or reports or anything like that that you can share down the road, because it makes this a better project. So let me start by showing this slide. I don't think you're allowed in the great network of Union State people who talk about Union Station to actually talk about Union Station without somehow making a reference to the wreck of the Federal Express. So this is mine. Back in the 1950s. None of the rest of my talk has anything to do with this, but I wanted to make sure that I got this out of the way because, like I said, this seems to be an important part of the giving a talk about the station. So you get the spectacular picture, and if you want to know more later, I'd be happy to tell you. What I'm really interested in talking about tonight, though, is, as you've heard, is the station's place in the history of Washington. That was really what got me interested in it when I was a graduate student at the University of North Carolina. I came up here to Washington one weekend, and I was walking near the station, and it was a Sunday afternoon, and there were a lot of people going in and out of the station. And of course, Washington was a very different place then, almost 30 years ago. And I was surprised because it was a Sunday and I didn't expect to see many people. So I went inside to investigate and pretty quickly discovered the mall that they had installed. This was a few years after it had opened. And I got curious about that. And I started doing a little bit of research about the station and found that there were a lot of things about the station that tied into the topics that I was interested in, the things that I was most interested in studying as a graduate student. There was urban history, there was architecture, there was transportation, there was economic development, there was 20th century US. And so as I started looking, I realized that if I wrote a history of the station, I could talk about the station, which I've continued to be really interested in. It's not one of those projects where I got in the middle of it and said, who was the dummy who picked this project? But also because I think it tells you so much about the history of Washington. And so Um, and so I've been excited to work on this. When I came up to Washington after I'd finished my classwork at UNC Chapel Hill, I was working part-time and working on my dissertation. And at some point I realized I was probably not going to be an academic. And so I thought it would be nice to have a full-time job and a full-time income. So I stopped working on my research very much. And then a few years ago, I was lucky enough, Matthew Gilmore, who some of you might know as the former librarian at the Washingtoniana division of the DC Public Library, he connected me with one of the editors at the Georgetown University Press, and they were interested in what I was doing. And so fortunately, it's worked out where I'm going to be able to write a book much sooner than I had hoped. And so I'm excited to share with you how I'm approaching it. And with luck, you'll be excited about it too. Let me talk a little bit about this image before I move on. This is a 1910 postcard. And some of you might know that during the early part of the 20th century, there was a postcard boom when the post office changed the rules for sending things through the mail. And I show this both because it's a great picture from the early days of the station, but it also shows something about what people who came to Washington and wanted a souvenir saw as a good souvenir. And so there are many postcards like this, inside, outside, color, black and white, different parts of the station. And while it's not as popular ever as the White House or the Capitol or the Washington Monument, there are a lot of them. And I think it starts to talk about how central Union Station was to the experience of coming to Washington. As Scarlett covered in the introduction she did, this is really the idea behind the book that I'm writing, that the station really says more about modern Washington than any other building. It's not a perfect model. There are things that happen in Washington that don't happen really at the station. There are things that happen at the station that are pretty much isolated to the station. But overall, you learn an enormous amount about the development of Washington in the 20th and now the 21st century. And I want to talk about a few of those tonight. I'll go into a little bit more detail. The obvious one is the station's connection to transportation. That at the time when the railroad was the way of getting from city to city, having a station like Union Station was a huge boost to Washington. But it plays out in other ways too. Economics, some is just the business of running the railroad, and that's both passenger travel, but also there's express, the small freight traffic they would have. But there's also the impact that the station has because hotels start to grow up around the station, and excuse me, and there are other businesses that are affected by putting the station in Washington and putting it where they do. Architecture, the station's design is very intentional to both say things about Washington, to say things about the people who own the station, and to connect to the architecture in the rest of the city. Putting a building that big in one neighborhood has an enormous effect on what happens around it, and you'll see a little bit of that in a couple of minutes. It really shapes the neighborhood, and even sometimes beyond the neighborhood. There are notes I found where people say that because of Union Station's location, basically on E and F streets in Northeast, it tends to pull the retail sector away from the mall because travel tends to go down F Street. And so those of you who are from Washington, the area of what we now think of a metro center where the department stores tend to be, that certainly wasn't dependent on Union Station, but Union Station seems to have had an effect on that. Politics come in, particularly in terms of how the station gets built, but then later on, particularly in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, you start seeing connections between how Washington is governed and what happens at the station. This is the social patterns. That's one of it's one of my favorite topics, really, because so much of what's playing out in Washington and often in the country is happening in the station, and it's easier to see in some ways in the station. So try to talk about that. And then finally, the revitalization of the station in the 1980s connects really well with what's happened in Washington itself. And I won't really talk about that tonight, but that's going to be in a lot of ways the final chapter of the book that I'm writing. Let me run through the chapters really quickly just to give you an overview of how I'm approaching this. So the first chapter is very much the period, sort of the 19th century of railroading in Washington, both why people here were so excited to have the railroad, but then how over time, even though they still want the railroad, they are increasingly unhappy with the two main railroads serving Washington, the Baltimore and Ohio, and the Pennsylvania. The second chapter ties into what happens around the turn of the 20th century, where Washington needs bigger stations. They want to change the way in which the railroads interact with the city. They have one plan, and then there's a second plan. Third chapter talks about building the station, which is in some ways my favorite chapter because it's complicated, it's a mess. If you ever hear people say, well, they don't build them like they used to, if the project not going well is something you think only happened today, the history of Union Station will show you that that's not the case. Chapter 4 talks about what happens when the station finally opened, how they finished up the construction, how they started learning how to use the station, because it's an incredible piece of technology that most of the people working there have never really had the kind of contact with before. And then it ends with talking about the first big event, the 1909 inauguration. It doesn't go well. There's a blizzard, and so it's not quite the grand opening that they had hoped for. Chapter 5 talks about the impact of the station on the neighborhood and the ways in which the different sides of the station, the east side, which basically stays residential, the north side, which becomes much more industrial, the west side, which is a mix, and then the south side, that area between the station and the Capitol, becomes really a formal, almost symbolic space, and how some of that is planned and some of it is almost accidental. Chapter 6 goes to a theme that you've probably heard about a lot in conversations about railroads, how Union Station was a gateway, or how railroad stations are a gateway. That's true in Washington, and I try to expand that idea past just this is how you come into the city, to talk about some other ideas to show how that metaphor is really true. Chapter 7 talks about how the station worked. And I mentioned a little bit earlier that the station was an incredible piece of technology. The technology mattered, but even more important were the people who were working at the station and how they figured out routines, then how they dealt with it when the routines weren't working. And it's a pretty remarkable story and pretty remarkable accomplishment. Chapter 8 focuses on the two world wars, because what happens at the station is quite reflective of what's happening in the country. There are changes in the routines that have been established before and after the war. It's also, particularly in World War II, Union Station is one of the busiest places in Washington and one of the busiest stations in the country. And so you see a lot about what life during the war was like. Chapter 9, some of you know the White City reference from the 1893 World's Fair and how architect Daniel Burnham was very associated with that, central to that. And then he came to design or help design the station. By the 1950s, however, no one really wants the station. And so that period, that chapter really talks about the search for something to do with this building that was designed very well for a specific purpose, but that purpose doesn't really exist much anymore. Chapter 10, those of you who were in Washington in the 1970s would probably remember the National Visitor Center, the first idea to try to reuse the station, kind of like the 1909 inauguration. It doesn't go well, but it leads up to the most recent period, which is the station really becomes a gateway again. People are riding the train again, so it's in that way, but also it's really central to the neighborhood once again, and helps shape what happens around it, but also in Washington more generally. let me pause there for a second. I don't know if anyone has questions about the introduction, but this would be a great time to ask if you're curious about the general approach that I'm taking. Okay, good. Well, then we'll keep going. So I mentioned that things change in the latter part of the 19th century. And a lot of, with railroading, and a lot of that is driven by the changes in the city itself. After the Civil War, Washington grows rapidly. So you'll see that there are about 135, 140,000 people in the city in 1870. 30 years later, the population has doubled. And that changes Washington in all kinds of ways. But one of the biggest is how people are going to get in and out of the city. In the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, the city has two stations. One is the Baltimore and Ohio station you can see on the left, which is just a few blocks from the Capitol. And it's built and expanded during the second half of the century, but it's still pretty small. The other station, it's often referred to as the Baltimore and Potomac because that's the subsidiary of the Pennsylvania Railroad that technically runs the station, is put at 6th and B Streets. And some of you might be wondering, well, where's B Street? Well, back at that point, that's what they referred to Constitution Avenue as. And if you're also trying to picture where that is, it's right on the corner of the mall, sort of where the old wing of the National Gallery is. And if you haven't seen the pictures, trains used to run up and down 6th Street, so they were running across the mall between about 1872 and 1907. The two stations were a big problem in Washington for the main fact that they really weren't big enough by the turn of the century. There's a quote I found from the Evening Star, which was the leading paper in Washington for a lot of the 19th century, and then for the first half, really first 3/4 of the 20th century. And they called the two stations inadequate and discreditable in the late 19th century. And in 1903, I think it was, Pennsylvania Railroad vice president was willing to admit to Congress that their station was a mere flea bite compared to what it ought to be. And this is a big deal, first of all, for the symbolic reasons that if people are coming to the Capitol, you ought to give them a grand entry, the grand gateway. And these two stations didn't do it. When you came out of the B&O station, for example, there was a sign on a wall selling, I think it was feed products. And there were a lot of saloons around both stations and things like that. So it was embarrassing for a lot of people. The other problem, though, was that because they were small, it was hard to get a lot of people in and out. And by this time in Washington's history, it was pretty clear that the city was not going to be an industrial center. So if Washington's going to grow, there are going to be two main factors. One is going to be government, but the other is going to be tourism. And so a lot of the local boosters and the railroads themselves want bigger stations because they want to be able to get more business into Washington. Finding bigger stations and getting better service into the city is one of the two big railroad issues in Washington in the latter part of the 19th century. The other part is what you can see here. And if you're wondering what this is an 1887 wreck. Baltimore, Ohio train ran into a carriage that was crossing the tracks at a grade crossing. And you can see one of the problems clearly was that the gate didn't come down, so the carriage probably went across the tracks. And you can see the overturned cars here, and you can see other wreckage. And this was a really common occurrence in Washington in the late 19th century. The exact number of accidents, nobody seems to have counted. It's clear from reading the old newspapers that in a typical year, anywhere between 3 and 5 people are killed at the grade crossings, either because they don't have gates or, for example, there's a story I found where the gate is down, but the person who's killed is a small child who fits under the gate. So he just goes running across the tracks because he has a new balloon. And so this becomes a huge concern for the people in Washington. But the railroads don't want to pay to eliminate the grade crossings. And so that leads ultimately to an exchange. And let me give you a second to read this quote. What ends up happening in the late 19th century in Washington is that there's the outlines of a deal being made along the lines of what Congressman Hemphill mentions. The railroads are going to get their bigger stations, which will get them more business, which will make them more money. But in return, the city is going to force them to get rid of grade crossings. And you might wonder, well, why didn't the city just force them to do that anyway, which happened in a lot of places in Chicago and Philadelphia, things like that. This is a period, unfortunately, where the local government doesn't have much power. And so the local government can stop things, like they can stop the construction of a new station, but they can't really force the railroads to do anything because Congress is really the local government at that point. So a deal is gradually worked out where the two railroads, the B&O and Pennsylvania, are each going to get new stations. And in return, they're going to agree to get rid of the grade crossings. And by the end of the century, there are about 50 different grade crossings in the city. So this is a big deal for residents. They don't really like the deal because what's going to happen is the B&O is going to get a bigger station close to where it is, close to the capital. But the Pennsylvania is actually going to get a much bigger station on the Mall. And the way they're going to build it is there's going to be a bigger station at the corner of 6th and B, 6th and Constitution Northwest. And then to get rid of grade crossings, they're going to build a 16-foot high viaduct that's going to run all the way across the Mall. And so on top of that is going to be running a locomotive, a steam locomotive. Smokestack might be as much as another 16 feet in the air. So if you were standing on the Capitol steps facing west towards the Washington Monument, 100 or so times a day, you would see a locomotive with cars going back and forth across the Mall. And that really didn't fit with a lot of people's view of what the Mall and the central part of Washington ought to look like. But the people here, the local government and the local voters don't have the power to stop that. So in 1900, that's what looks like is going to happen. Then things change pretty rapidly. And I want to talk about this map just for a second so you can put things into place. So the big stocking-shaped piece right here, this is Union Station. This is the actual building itself. And then these are the tracks. And these are the tracks running north. This is the branch to Baltimore. This is the branch of the Baltimore, Ohio that goes off to Chicago. And if you're wondering why there's two lines, well, one is the Baltimore, Ohio north, and one is the Pennsylvania Railroad north. Then if you track down this way, this is the tunnel that currently runs under Capitol Hill. It bends through South Washington, runs this way, and then crosses the Potomac. Two things that are a little harder to see, but I hope come through clearly on your screen. Over here is where the old Baltimore and Potomac depot was, and you can see it's right on this corner, this northeast corner of the Mall. And then the old Baltimore, Ohio station is right here, this little tail coming out of Union Station. And so that's where the old stations were. And in 1900, what really happens, in really 1901, is that the Pennsylvania Railroad has control over the Baltimore, Ohio, because the Baltimore, Ohio has some financial problems, and so the Pennsylvania buys a lot of its stock. At the same time, the Pennsylvania wants a new station, but it's nervous about building right here because it knows that movements like City Beautiful and just generally a greater interest in parks are growing, and they're afraid that if they build a new station down where the Baltimore and Potomac depot is, they build a new one right here, in a few years, people will be mad enough to force them off the Mall. So what ends up happening is the Pennsylvania Railroad basically makes a deal to leave the Mall and move to Union Station. And there's a story around how the Pennsylvania Railroad did this out of the goodness of their hearts, but they didn't any more than any major corporation today would have done that. They left because they were worried about getting forced out. And so they could relocate here, still close to downtown, but in a position where they were very unlikely ever to be asked to leave. So then they'd only have to build one station, not build one, and then 20 years later have to pay for another one. The place that they build a station is this neighborhood, and this is a view from the US Capitol looking north. The neighborhood down in here, where the station's going to go, is known as Swamp Oodle. It's not quite clear where that name comes from. Some people think it's because it was a contraction of swamp and puddle, but that's not really. There's other swamp oodles in other cities, so it may also have been borrowed from there. What you can see right here, if you look on your screen, is a cloud of smoke, and this is an engine going to the Baltimore and Ohio depot, which is hard to see, but it's just over this way. This is a working class, mostly Irish neighborhood, but there's people from a lot of different ethnic and racial backgrounds in that area, and it's apartment buildings and some row houses and shops and things like that. So they decide to build Union Station in the spot that I showed you, and I want to show you one or two pictures of construction, mostly because I think they're really cool. So this is a picture from the station looking back towards the Capitol. So this is sort of the opposite side of Swamp Oodle looking up. And there's an enormous number of things here. I hope most of you can see them, but I'll run through them just real quickly. You can obviously see the Capitol Dome here. And like I said, this is looking south from Union Station. Right here is the tunnel that's bringing the trains under Capitol Hill to the station, the trains from the south. Then what you can see right here is there's an enormous amount of filling being done at Union Station. And so this area down here, this is Massachusetts Avenue. This is the height of the area before construction started. Up here is where the height is going to be. In some places, like in front of the station, there's almost 30 feet of fill. What you can see here is some of the many tracks that were around the job site. These aren't actually tracks for permanent railroads yet, because if you look up here, these dark spots, these are actually trains waiting to go in and out of the Baltimore, Ohio station, and they ran down this way. Later, the trains will be brought through the tracks. The final thing I want to show you, to just give you a little perspective, if you can see this little white spot here, that's actually a horse-drawn carriage. So that's part of this, gives you a sense of the scale of the work that they're doing. And this is a picture from the Library of Congress, and if you go online, you can see it. This is another picture from the Library of Congress. This is remarkably the winter of 1907. It's January of 1907. The station opens about 9 months later, so you can see all the work they still had to do. And somehow they make it. The station's not quite done when they open it, but they finish it up in the next 6 months or so. And you can see, even though the station is a very traditional looking building on the outside with all the marble, excuse me, or all the granite, excuse me, it's really a modern building in terms of having a steel superstructure. The opening slide, while you were waiting, has that very elegant view of Union Station. And over time, that is what developed. But this is a photo from 1909 or 1910, and it gives you a sense of what it was like to come to Union Station right after it had opened. Not nearly as elegant. You can see they have service, like here. This is a streetcar coming in to serve the people coming to the front doors. But there is a lot of work to do here. You can still see there's still a little bit of construction going on here. Those of you who know the station well know that in a few years they'll have statues up here, but they're not ready yet. And I think it's easy to forget that the area around the station didn't always look like it did, that it took a lot of work to create the gateway that you see today. I want to take just a minute to talk about what happened when they built it. The station was supposed to be done in time for the 1905 inauguration. And when I say was supposed to be done, construction started in the summer of 1903. So it was supposed to be done in 18 months, maybe 20 months. Instead, it takes them twice that long. And not only does it take them a lot longer, but as you can see from these numbers, it costs a lot more money. And they hit all kinds of problems, from not really thinking through how they're going to route the trains around the site, to needing a lot more fill, to fights with the contractors. And so that $31 million, which covers both the station, but also work that the Pennsylvania did and the Baltimore, Ohio did, that's probably the equivalent of about $1 billion today. And so I mentioned earlier, when people say, well, they don't build them like they used to, this to me is one of the examples of they do. They run way over budget on a big project like this. And when you read the records, you can see all the unhappiness. One of the contractors says, I would be better off going to China than to continue to work on this project. But the thing is, for all of them, this is such a high profile project, nobody can afford to walk away from it. So ultimately, they get it finished. Let me pause here. I don't know, Scarlett, are there questions? I don't have the chat up.
Yes, the first question that we have from John Eldridge.
Mm-hmm.
Did they put the underground tracks in at the same time they built Union Station?
Sorry, the underground tracks, like the tunnel tracks, or?
I assume that's right. Is that correct, John? Let's assume that that's the question, that
Yeah.
the tunnel underneath the
Yeah. So yeah, all that work was done. The new route through South Washington, south of the mall, the tunnel, new yards, as those of you who are from here, as you go up New York Avenue, all that was done as part of what the railroads rather boringly refer to as the Washington Improvement, because they needed those pieces to fit together, get rid of grade crossings, to make it easy to operate the trains in and out of the station. So, so all that was done at the same time.
Thank you. Ed also noted that the Italian immigrants did most of the digging for those tracks.
Yes, they did.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Moving on.
Okay.
And there were a couple of questions sent to me privately. This is Anne. So let me raise those. And the question was back to the book.
Mm-hmm.
What is the book narrative style? Is this book meant as a social history, or does it contain historical conversations, either contemporary or gathered from historical and bibliological resources?
And I missed the very end of what you were saying. Could you say it again?
Or is this, does the book include historical conversations, either from a contemporary perspective, or is it based on historical biographical resources?
Yeah, most of it is, I've developed it from historical resources, from things like the records of the Pennsylvania Railroad or old newspaper clippings. Photographs have been a really big help. Then there have been some more technical things, like an arbitration hearing for the guys who worked in the tower, in K Tower, because they're unhappy with the way they've been treated. So they talk in a lot of detail about, here's how the station works. And so for someone who's interested in that kind of thing like me, it's a great resource. So it's written, I'd like to think, in a narrative style. So there's really a story about what happened, why did it happen, how did it affect the people in Washington. And fortunately, there are a lot of good collections of materials here. The story of the construction of the station, there are great papers from the architects talking about what was working and what wasn't. So try to pull all those things in together.
Okay, and then as a follow-up question, this person asks, what is the book's point of view? And that is looking at the intended audience. Is it an academic study? Is it a compelling history for railroad historians? Is it an urban history reader? And basically, will this be enjoyable read for the general public?
Of course, as an author, I'm compelled to say that it's for all those audiences, and that you should buy multiple copies when it comes out and give them as gifts. uh, it's not intended as an academic history. I mean, there are pieces of that that come in. It's my background, and there's some questions that I'm interested in answering. But to me, it's much more of a narrative history. I think the station is a great place. As I've mentioned, it connects to so much of Washington's history. And so I really want to show that. You could know very little about trains and still find it interesting, I hope. But I'm also working hard so that for people who are interested in the railroad, you get some of that. And I've been fortunate enough to have some people who really know that stuff help me put that in context so I can understand, well, this was really a breakthrough, or this was an important thing to note, so that if that's that the technical part of it, if you want to put it that way, that comes through. And it's the same with construction, talking enough about that so you can see why it's important or why the station would stand out, without going into so much detail that if that's not what's interesting to you, you would still find the book interesting.
Well, you have a fan already. A person is saying I will have to promote it on my site and Facebook page.
All right, good. Well, thank you.
With that, maybe we should go to the rest of the conversation.
Yeah. So there are two parts of the history that I want to talk about in a little bit more detail. And part of that is because I think they're really central to the history of Union Station, but also because I'm going to end with a request connected to these two pieces. So the first one that I want to talk about is traveling through Union Station. And the picture you can see there, this is from the west end of the station, and you just get some sense of how much was happening. This is sort of a typical travel day, and you can see different groups of people, different types of people coming in here. Of course, you see people dressed up because that's how you traveled. This is the area, if you're wondering about it, where the metro comes up today. And so travel obviously is central to the experience of Union Station, or the history of Union Station. And there's a few elements of that that I just want to highlight briefly. This is an ad from the Baltimore and Ohio, and this comes courtesy of John Hankey. This is 1909. And I show this because I think it's easy to think of the station just as the place you get in and out of. Like, this is where you start your visit to Washington. But as you can see from this, it was really part of the efforts a lot of people or a lot of companies made to sell the station, that this would be an ad to get people to come. And so they could have shown a lot of things. They could have shown the Capitol, or they could have shown the White House or the monuments. But you see a lot of this. And I think it really ties into the idea that the station is a central place in the Capitol, and a central place that people think of when they think of the Capitol, and that postcard would be another example of that. A second idea that I bring out in the book is that it's easy to think of the station as a gateway to Washington, but I also think it's really important to think about it as a gateway from Washington, or a gateway for the people who live here. So let me give you a second to just read this quote, which comes from a Washington Post story in 1937. It wasn't particularly hard to find comments like this or other examples that show, even for the people who lived in Washington, the station was a really important building. There are dance performances I found an example of, and they're all about what you see at the station. Or other people talking about how when they're taking a trip, residents of DC, they're taking a trip, for them, the way they talk about it, it's clear the trip starts not when they leave their house so much as when they get to Union Station. And I think that's a part that's easy to forget, but is clearly an important part of the station's role in the Capitol. A third idea is tied into this quote. And again, I'll give you just a moment to read this. one of the other things that comes through as you look at people's experiences at the station is that of the people who came through the station because they weren't just visiting here, but they were coming to stay. And this is, I think, a particularly nice one because of the way it's told. And the book that it comes from was written by a professor at Howard University here in DC. She interviewed a lot of African-American women who moved mostly from the South to become domestics here. And they talk about what it was like to arrive here from the parts of the South that they had been living in. And it's a great reminder that in a lot of cases, the station is the first really memorable place that people come to. And so it has a particular part of their memory and a part of the memory the city, people in the city continue to have, even if they've been here for quite a long time. A final thing I want to talk about in terms of travel through the station is the way in which the station illustrated the differences in travel between whites and African Americans. This story, I don't expect you to be able to read it. If you can, great, but it's really talking about the restaurant that was in the east wing of the station. And what ends up happening is that there's a ruling that if African American travelers want to eat in the restaurant, they must be allowed to. And if you're wondering, there was never a set of separate facilities for Blacks at Union Station. There weren't separate bathrooms, there weren't separate water fountains, there weren't separate restaurants, waiting rooms, any of that. But that doesn't mean that they were treated the same way. And one of the stories that I found is that there's a group of diners who comes in, African-American diners who come in, and they are served in the station, but they are put in a corner and they are separated from the rest of the room by wooden screens. And so it gives you a sense of some of the complications and discrimination that takes place. At the same time, to make it even more complicated, there are stories. Carter Woodson, who some of you probably know was one of the first well-respected scholars of African-American history. He himself was African-American. He would eat at the station with his white colleagues because it was one of the few restaurants in Washington where Blacks and whites would be served together. And so I like, in telling the story of Union Station, how it plays, or it illustrates a lot of those kind of complications. The second area that I want to just highlight a little bit of is working at the station, because the more I've learned about how the station actually operated, the more impressed I've been. And this is an old picture from the 1940s of a clerk working in the station master's office. And so the station was really a remarkable place of, I mentioned technology before, but just the level of activity that took place was really remarkable. And I chose the late 1920s because it's before the Depression comes. So there were approximately 300 trains coming through each day, pretty much evenly split between arrivals and departures. There were about 220 employees at this period. During World War II, it gets all the way up to more than 4,000 people. And then finally, there were about 200 movements over the K interlocking. And if that doesn't mean much to you, I'll talk about it in a moment. But that means that between the trains that were coming in, the trains that needed shifting, for example, the train might arrive from one city, part of it is going on to another city, but not all of it. They have to cut the cars in and out. And it's a remarkable level of activity. And the guys who worked in the tower, who were controlling those movements, talk about, not surprisingly, how stressful it was to try to keep track of everything, because they didn't just have to do that. They had to figure out how fast the trains were moving out in the yards, because if you went too fast, you got fined. They had to make sure that the people driving the locomotives hadn't worked too many hours, because that was a violation too. And so it was a well-paid, well-respected job, but it was also the kind of job that, if you read this arbitration they were part of, also sometimes became too much for people and they basically couldn't do it anymore because of the stress. So this is in K Tower, and if you've ridden in and out of Union Station, you can still see K Tower. It's named that because it's basically where K Street cuts under the tracks. And what you see here is the cabinet that controlled most of the switches and signals, the main set of signals and switches at Union Station. And if you can see it up here, this is actually a map of the station. And so kind of like people who are really good typists, the towermen didn't need to look at these levers, which moved a piece of track or set a signal to red or green, depending on whether the train could go. They didn't need to look at this. Instead, they looked at this map, and this map had a set of tiny little lights in it. And when a train was on that piece of track, the light would go out. So the people working in the tower knew that they couldn't shift a train onto that track. And there are people who would argue that interlocking, as this was called, because it connected the switches and the signals and tried to keep the trains from being on the track, two trains from being on the track at the same time, was in some ways the first computer. But it was really a great piece of technology, and excuse me, and it was also very expensive. But because they were in Washington, they felt like they couldn't do anything else except buy the best equipment. Final piece of work that I just want to talk about quickly. This is another, obviously, picture of the waiting room. And you can see right here, I don't know if you can read it, but this is the traveler's aid desk. If people need help, they come here. Then down here is the information booth. And then through here, and for those of you who are familiar with the station, this is the east end down at the bottom. This is the west end. If you were to go through these doors, you would go out to what is now the shopping area. So down here was at that point the ticket lobby, and the ticket windows were down this side, and the baggage windows were down this side. And in the baggage room, for example, if you came and brought them bags, you would check them with the counterman. He would take them back into the baggage room and then put them down a slide so that all the baggage was sorted in the basement. That let them move the bags on the lower level, which meant that it didn't interfere with passengers walking around, walking to their trains. And that was just one of the many pieces of clever design that was in the station. If you're wondering about these desks, they were selling things. This was probably more like a drugstore, newspapers and snacks and things like that. Along here would have been Travelers Insurance or Western Union if you need to sell a telegram or something like that. The final group of workers I'll mention here is normally along here would be a bunch of red caps waiting to help people with their bags. And I mentioned the red caps because another defining feature of working at the station was that the jobs were very segregated. Before World War II, it's very hard to find an example of whites and blacks doing the same job. And as you probably imagine, almost all the high-paying white-collar jobs were done by whites. So porters or cleaners or red caps, those were seen as appropriate jobs for African Americans, but really none of the office positions were. Final thing I'll mention, and then take some more questions if there are some, is during the two world wars, not surprisingly, women got opportunity for jobs that they didn't get in peacetime periods. This is a picture from World War II, someone working in the ticket office. Both in World War I and World War II, the ticket offices become predominantly female. In World War II, women get not just those sort of typical office or white collar job, but really start doing a lot of work out in the shops, out in Ivy City, sort of the Union Station equivalent of Rosie the Riveter. And so you start seeing that in World War II. You don't see much of it in World War I. But again, I like this part because it shows how some social patterns are playing out in Union Station. That's the end really of my presentation. I don't know if there are other questions that have come up in the last 10 or 15 minutes.
Yes, we have a question, Bill, from Donna Dolan, noting that the chapter had a speaker who was heading the building of the second tunnel at Virginia Avenue. This was a few years ago at the banquet, the new tunnel. He gave details of surprises found when the construction was in full works. Did the original builders, the contractors, leave detailed plans of the surrounding areas and also the minute details of the station itself when looking to the future?
There are very good drawings of the station. I think they're mostly at the Library of Congress. They might have moved back to the Union Station Redevelopment Corporation, but those documents are there. I've never seen drawings of the tunnels. Doesn't mean they don't exist, but I would think I probably would have come across them. And yeah, they did. The tunnel under Capitol Hill, the First Street Tunnel, and the expanded Virginia Avenue Tunnel at the same time. And those of you who are interested in that, if you go to the Library of Congress website, there's some really great pictures of building the tunnel. And I'll just tell one quick story. To build a to build the tunnel to the station, the First Street Tunnel, they decided to bore under Capitol Hill rather than cut and cover. And so to be able to bore it out, they had to pump all the water out. And that meant that there was a lot of places where the ground sank, and particularly along First Street. So they had to do a lot of repairs. When the cracks in First Street started showing up, the contractors started getting a lot of people saying, you cracked the wall of my house by the water you were pumping out. And this would have been 1905, 1906. You ought to pay me. Well, it turns out that the contractors who were doing the tunneling had seen this game before. And so before they had started any work, they had walked down First Street and some of the other adjacent streets and taken pictures of every house, so that when someone came and said, you pumped out water, you owe me money because look at the damage that you did to my house, they could go back and look at their photographs. And apparently more often than not, the damage to the front of those houses was actually there before, that people were just coming to see if they could get the railroad to pay them for something, that a problem they already had. So the tunneling is really interesting, and how they did it is fascinating. And if someone does know where those plans are, I would be really interested to see them.
Thank you. We have another question from Jim L. Do you have information on postal operations and the tunnel that I believe existed between the baggage room and the post office building?
Yeah, so what they actually did, and you can see one of them, there's still that bridge over First Street between the station and the old post office. That was the way they connected the station a lot of the time. It changes a little bit after World War II because they built a big mail handling facility on the east side of the station rather than the west side. I have some material about how the post office worked and how it interacted with the station. And I know there are a couple people who know a lot about it that I really need to follow up with. One of the things that you see is that during particularly the holiday season, there are pictures, and in some ways it's hard for people to walk around because there's so much mail left in the concourse, just huge bags of mail that they're going to load on the trains at the station. So I know some pieces. I'm not certain I answered that question entirely. So Jim, if you have another one or a follow-up, I'd be happy to tell you more.
We do have one follow-up on that topic. The rail post office was also another rail occupation available to African Americans in the 1930s on. Did you come across any RPO history or employee accounts related to RPO, or were the RPO activities separate from Union Station?
I haven't seen it, and it's a really interesting question. I would think that I would have seen more, like there are mentions of it in the records of like the Pennsylvania Railroad or the Baltimore, Ohio, but it's not very central to it. So whoever asked that question, if you know more about that, I would love to hear it.
I will just interject there that we do have had a program on that, and we have a contact at the museum there that has a lot more of that material. It might be a good thing for a follow-up article or references so we can put that information out there. Earlier on, we had a bit of back and forth about K Tower as to where it is and is it in operation today, which I think we crowdsourced the answer to that. If there's anything else you'd like to tell us about the always fascinating K Tower. No, it's an
Yes.
excellent time.
So there were really three towers at Union Station. There was one that controlled the entrance to the tunnel, the First Street Tunnel. And then there was one up farther north that controlled the entrance to the yards and trains coming in off the Baltimore, Ohio, or the Pennsylvania Railroad tracks. But K Tower was the big one. And if any of you have seen the plans for the expansion of the passenger station and then the development of the air rights over the tracks, they're working hard, at least in the drawings, it looks like they're working hard to do something to really commemorate K Tower and its important role in the station, even though today it's kind of a forgotten, like people see the building but don't really appreciate what it is. It was so central to the operations of the station. I think it's great that they're trying to do something with that as they really develop the area over the tracks behind Union Station.
We have a couple more still on the station. How many tracks were there in total? My understanding is that it went up to 44. 30 is the last one that exists today.
I've never seen a drawing that has that many tracks, and typically you see, I want to say 32. Now it might depend a little bit on how you're counting, because there could have been some spurs off to the power plant, or there was a Railway Express building on the east side. I mean, the building's still there. You can see it when you're at the station. It's now office space. So I've never seen 44, but if someone has, I'd love to see it.
And we're just about at the end of our time. I'll bring this up, recognizing that this could be a whole other presentation in itself. I wish to know more about Long Bridge over the Potomac River and how it relates to Union Station. So if you have anything that you can tell us in the time we have about the bridge and Union Station, I'm sure that will be a fascinating way to end.
Yeah, well, that too was part of the whole Washington improvement. And it was, that bridge is actually a repurposed bridge, a recycled bridge that the Pennsylvania Railroad brought it from, I want to say somewhere in New Jersey. I'd have to look it up, but they didn't build that bridge new. They brought it down and put it in a river. And for people in Washington, it was a big step forward, because the previous Long Bridge, as some of you know, put rail traffic and horse traffic and then car traffic all sort of on the same deck. And if that was not enough of a problem, the Long Bridge, the 19th century one, was very low. And so in the late 1880s, when there was there was a flood, basically, the bridge served as a dam and started directing water into the city. And so while we might look at the current Long Bridge as not particularly elegant, it was seen as a big step forward in those days from what they'd had before. And
for your reference, Bill, Jim posted, there is a link on the chapter website with the history of the Long Bridge for those of you who are interested. It's a good read I'd forgotten all about.
Yeah, great. So the last thing I just want to mention, if either something I said tonight doesn't sound quite like what you know, it could be that you're right and I'm wrong. One of the things I've learned from this project, I've learned a lot of things, not all of which have proven to be true, even though they've been told to me in great confidence. So if you've heard something that you think is not quite right, or you have something to add, or you have questions, or anything else that you'd be interested in talking about, just send me an email. I would be happy to hear from you. I know I still have many, many things to learn, and I really would welcome those comments. Now I'm done. Thank you. And thank you, everybody who joined tonight. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, and Bill, thank you for sharing your research with us and for helping to make this Zoom presentation a real success. We're looking forward to reading your book, And we are counting on you to let us know when it's available so that we can get the word out to our members. It's just been a real pleasure to work with you on this and very interesting program.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity.
All right, and in closing tonight then, thank you all for joining us tonight. I want to direct your attention to our next program, which will also be a Zoom program. It is called the East Broadtop Railroad Then and Now. This will be on Friday, July the 17th at 7:30, a Zoom program. And this one I'm really looking forward to this. As many of you know, the East Broadtop was recently acquired by a new foundation that was established to both preserve the railroad and to return it to operations. And so we will have Andy Van Syok. Many of you know Andy. He is the president of the Friends of the East Broadtop. And we will also have the management from the new foundation who is actually spearheading the operations up there to tell us a little bit about the history of the railroad and where they stand today. The registration for that opens on July 1st. And so I really hope you all will be able to join us for that. All right. So in conclusion, thank you again for joining us, and thank you, Bill. This has just really been fantastic. For everybody else out there, if you have program suggestions, send an email to programs@dcnrhs.org. I'll see that, and I can also bring in others as needed. And finally, I just want to thank Ann Mason, who is, you haven't seen her face tonight. She's behind the scenes, and she has been the one who's really spearheaded the Zoom effort and made it possible for us to deliver a program in this format. Thank you very much. And with that, I will say good night.